Thank you, Nicola. Well, I see several elements why diversity, equity, and inclusion, so in short, DEI, have become increasingly important on the work floor. First, we see an increased sensitivity around diversity and discrimination issues. Big social movements like #MeToo and #Black Lives Matters have stressed the challenges and the opportunities that DEI represents for organizations and individuals. And we've seen that these movements have also changed the expectations of workers and customers. And they expect companies to be transparent about what they are doing, to take responsibility for their actions, to treat everyone with respect. And so social expectations is in fact one reason why company directors should care about DEI. Second, DEI issues are also important because they coincide with talent shortages in a tightening labor market, which we see in Belgium and abroad. And this is pushing many organizations to distinguish themselves as preferred employers and to prioritize employee well-being and to foster a supportive workplace environment in order to attract and retain diverse and skilled talent. And so moreover, we see that organizations need to adapt to the changing needs and expectations of a more diverse and younger workforce. And we see that younger workers are more clued in about problems like harassment and discrimination. They want to work in a place that includes everyone and values different kind of people. All workers do, but we see this in particular for as important for younger workers. And they also expect management to lead in a way that is more people-oriented, collaborative, and empowering to employees. And so talent management is another reason why company directors should care about this. And third, DEI issues are also important because they are subject to an increasingly stricter legal framework. And this legal framework includes various recent or upcoming initiatives. One example is the EU Women on Boards Directive. This directive aims to increase the representation of the underrepresented sex in the board of listed companies. Another example is the EU Pay Transparency Directive. This directive creates additional information duties, reporting duties and remedies and enforcement provisions to combat pay inequality between women and men. To give you an example, job applicants must be informed about the pay range for a position, and employees will also have the right to request certain information about their own pay levels and the average pay levels within the organization for comparable roles. There is also the Belgian Act and Code on Wellbeing at Work, which already exists for quite some time, but continues to play an important role as well. This act requires employers to implement a policy to enhance the well-being of employees and prevent psychosocial risks such as stress, violence, and unwanted sexual behavior. The Act also set out internal procedures to support employees who may encounter inappropriate behavior at work. There have also been recent developments in Belgian anti-discrimination legislation, which protects individuals from discrimination on various grounds. And the EU Whistleblowing Directive is also worth referring to. This directive, which has been implemented in European jurisdiction in the meantime, gives legal protection to whistleblowers, irrespective of their employment status. Also, the upcoming changes in tort law may have an impact, with the abolishment of the quasi-immunity from a direct tort claim brought by the company or by third parties, which may have an impact on directors. And moreover, we see that public labor prosecutors are now paying more attention to misconduct at work. Cases involving harassment or toxic leadership are more frequent and receive a higher priority from these public labor prosecutors. There are also some new changes that could make it more likely for someone to face criminal charges For example, the rules for what counts as a crime under laws against discriminations have been broadened. And we also see that groups like trade unions or equal opportunity bodies are using criminal law more often to address these issues. And they are not just targeting companies, but sometimes they are also targeting directors personally. So for me, legal compliance is a very important reason why company directors should care about it. And finally, D&I issues are also important because they are increasingly a topic that companies are required to report on publicly, and which creates additional transparency and accountability for company directors. And these reporting duties are another reason for boards to monitor company culture and DEI performance. So in conclusion, Nicola, there are several reasons why DEI is increasingly important on the work floor. And I think directors should care about them for these various reasons, ranging, as I explained, from social expectations and talent management to legal compliance and reporting duties.
Thank you very much, Inge. Very interesting. And we see indeed that there are many factors that play a role here and that might induce directors to pay attention to this. So thank you very much for the explanations. And the next question is, of course, while we know why we should care about it, the question is, what should we do about it? And for this, I would like to turn to Geraldine and ask you, Geraldine, how do you bring this topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the HR policy of your company, of Umicore? And also, what does it mean in terms of ESG? Can you please tell us a bit more about that? Thank you.
Of course, Nicolas. Well, it's, as you said, it's really important to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion into your HR policies. But maybe I would like to just first take a step back, because in my opinion, you need to start by making sure that D&I is part of your company culture. And that is, part of what defines who you are as a company. That's really the first step you need to take. So you need to make sure that diversity, equity, inclusion is integrated in your values. And only then, when you've created this basis, then you can start by translating these values and this company culture into policy. You really need that first step first. So at Umicore, diversity, equity, and inclusion is really part of what we call the Umicore Way. And the Umicore Way is really what lays out the essence of what we believe and what we really stand for. And so once you have that culture in the Umicore Way for us, then you can start building on the next level. And the next layer is then your diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Umicore is been a really early adopter of sustainability since really, really long time. We've been driven by ESG since more than 20 years. And as part of our ESG, we have a Let's Go for Zero strategy. That's how we call it. And that has 3 pillars. So the first pillar is zero harm. The second one is zero inequality. And then we also have net zero greenhouse gases. But, as you can imagine, diversity, equity, and inclusion are really an integral part of those 2 first pillars, zero harm and zero inequality, because they make sure that we aim for the employees' well-being, diversity, inclusion, and equality. And so, like many companies, that's part of our ESG strategy. And we have developed a very specific diversity and inclusion policy. And it's a really important step. But again, it's just one step in a larger framework, in a larger process. So you need to, once you have that overall global policy, you need to make sure that the values and that this policy is integrated in your day-to-day activities, that it's really lived. And just a policy doesn't work to make that happen. So then you need to translate that diversity, equity, and inclusion policy into concrete actions and concrete requirements in everything that you do. So we have diversity, equity, and inclusion elements in how we do our employer branding, how do we write job descriptions, how do we do interviews, how do we test our candidates, all the way and including to your exit interviews. If people leave your company, you do an exit interview, and you also try to incorporate in that these different elements to see if they played a role in the person leaving. So it's really everywhere. And what you also need to do is make sure that you do employee surveys and pulse surveys, so you always know where you're at. So that's really how we make it concrete and practical. So you spell it out, you make sure that you have the data, and that you provide necessary training. And then as a final step, when you have gone through the culture, the policy, and the concrete actions, finally, what we also do is that we set really concrete and clear KPIs, targets, and objectives regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we also link these to compensation. So for instance, me as a management board member, my compensation, my variable compensation is directly linked to the performance of the company with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as you can really see, it's really integrated in every single step and every single layer.
Okay, thank you, Geraldine. Very interesting to see indeed how the different layers in your organization from a very cultural point of view, and everything is declined towards the more practical and day-to-day life of your company. It is very interesting to hear. And and it's also interesting to see that there is a lot of sustainability, ESG aspects in all of this. And also speaking of ESG, we hear a lot today about about sustainability reporting, and especially the Sustainability Reporting Directive, the so-called CSRD. And I would like to turn to Christian and ask what could be the impact of such a directive as CSRD and sustainability reporting in general on DEI, on sustainable HR, and what would you advise to companies to make sure that this CSRD is properly integrated and that it is useful for DEI?
Thank you, Nicola. Happy to answer that question. First of all, we think that the impact of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive on DE&I should not be underestimated, and that is then probably even an understatement. Compared to what the current or previous legislation, put it in a better way, the non-financial reporting directive, there are two big changes. One, the scope of entities that will need to report is enlarged considerably, but I'll not go into that detail. And the other big change compared with the previous legislation is that under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, there is now a very detailed set of European reporting standards that has been set out in a delegated act of the European Commission. And that will change how and with what kind of level companies will need to report, and diversity, equality, and inclusion are topics that have caught the attention of our legislators. Even today, under the previous system, diversity was one of the topics that, in particular, listed companies had to report on. But what we saw in practice was that there was a big variation in how companies reported on these matters. And for example, we did a review on diversity and inclusion reporting by Bell 20 companies over the previous financial year, meaning financial year 2022. And in that context, most listed companies provided insight in relation to diversity, with all of them reporting on gender diversity in the composition of their governance bodies. but only about 20% of them reporting on gender diversity in the wider organization. And in relation to other types of diversity, reporting was even more disparate, with a majority including information on diversity initiatives in some detail, but only a limited number reporting actual figures. And that will definitely change under the new directive, and that will kick in for the biggest organizations as from this financial year. And to illustrate that a little bit in relation to DE&I, the Delegated Act sets out very detailed reporting standards with respect to gender equality, equal pay, diversity within governance bodies, diversity within the workforce, inclusion and positive action for vulnerable groups, and work-related incidents of discrimination and harassment. And to illustrate that a little bit, apart from detailed reporting on what kind of policies are available within the organization, companies will need to report on a wide range of diversity metrics over a wide range of criteria, including gender, but obviously, but in addition to that, numbers of age distribution of the workforce will need to be reported. Numbers about the percentage of employees with a disability will need to be reported. And then turning back to just an example, very concrete example, in relation to incidents of discrimination and harassment, corporates will need to disclose, apart from their policies, they will need to disclose any incidents of harassment and discrimination. And in particular, they will need to report how many incidents occurred, in how many incident complaints were filed, and moreover, they will need to disclose what kind of damages in amount or fines or penalties were imposed in that context. So the directive will change to a large extent how companies report, and that in itself will increase to a large extent transparency in this area, and it will create pressure on organizations, and obviously that is part of the game here, to improve their diversity, equality, and inclusion policies and practices. So the impact should indeed not underestimate it. Turning then to your question, what can companies do to prepare themselves? I think I would like to highlight 2 points here. I think the most important one probably is that organizations should do a mapping exercise. They should identify in relation to each of these reporting areas what they would need to report, and in function of that, they may want to check to what extent that they should improve their level of compliance with some areas, but they can also identify gaps or areas where they are able to improve either the policy framework in place or practices. And then a second point, especially in relation to diversity and inclusion, that is an important one. As I said, organizations will need to report in relation to diversity, inclusion, and equality. And there is obviously some kind of tension between, on the one hand, these reporting obligations, and on the other hand, the sensitive criteria, personal data that are behind these protected discrimination grounds in relation to which employers and organizations need to report and need to act. And from that perspective, it is probably also good in that exercise to review GDPR policies and privacy notices. So with these 2 elements, I think these should be both high on the corporate agenda. Nicola, back to you.
Thank you, Christian. Very interesting to hear indeed about the impact on CSRD, which is, of course, there will be a large impact on reporting obligation as such, but also probably an impact also putting pressure on companies to take actions on those aspects. So certainly a reason to take action in this regard. Please, no, Geraldine, can you tell me how do you see the role of the CSRD maybe in your own company with regards to DEI? What do you think about it?
Well, I can only echo what Christian was saying. So we are already reporting on diversity, equity, inclusion today in line with the non-financial reporting directive. So we already report on these topics. So it's not the topics that change for us, but as Christian said, today there are no standards as to how you need to report. So we report in a way that makes sense to us as a company, as an industry, and also taking into account things that are important in the different regions where we play, because we don't only play in Europe, we are active throughout the world. So we try to make sense out of this diversity, equity, and inclusion reporting requirement. Now, many companies do that, and as a result, I understand that it's very difficult to compare, and it's not easy to benchmark because everybody tries to do their best in their own way. So now the CSRD is bringing this standardization, and with the ESRS, the standards, they try to harmonize the terms and tell you what everything means and what they expect from you. So for us, it's not the new standards don't really impact so much at what we look at because we look at these things, but it affects how we have to look at the things. It affects how we have to report, in what depth, and how they classify things. Because I didn't realize this myself before, but words don't mean the same everywhere. So, for instance, the composition of your workforce is very important because you don't want a very high disproportionate number of non-employees compared to employees, because companies could, do that in order to avoid employees having certain rights as to pay or unionization or other things. So the term of non-employee and employee is a really important element in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But if you start looking at what is a contractor, what is a non-employee in a country like the Philippines or in China or in Africa, it's a very different standard from what you have here in Belgium. So it's very difficult to analyze these terms and apply them in practice. And that's what really requires a lot of work, and that should not be underestimated. Another element that I kind of hinted to is that something that people sometimes forget is that the CSRD really looks at diversity, equity, and inclusion through a European lens. And for a large international company like ours, that brings really another layer of complexity, because in different regions, different issues are requiring attention. And unfortunately, not every region has the level and the standards that Europe. So we cannot leave those issues behind at all. So it adds a little bit, because they're not always looking through the same lens as we would be looking. So for us, the effort lies not so much in the topic, but on how to translate it and how to align what we have today with what CSRD wants from us. And we're currently actually doing the gap analysis that Christian was referring to. So we're in the process today. And we already know now that based on that, we will require a lot of effort and a lot of change management to be able to comply in 2024, in 2025, with the reporting requirements for 2024. Now, luckily, they're being phased in. Everything is not at the same time, but for us, there is already a very big step to be taken next year. So a lot of effort being put into compliance with the CSRD.
Okay, thank you, Geraldine, for this testimonial. It seems to be indeed quite a challenge, and I think you're not the only company struggling with such requirements, but let's hope that will also be useful to lead to positive actions with regards to DEI and sustainability more generally. I would like also to turn to Inge, because Inge, you mentioned another piece of legislation, which is the whistleblowing directive. Maybe you could explain a bit more what it is, and what also, because you wrote something very interesting in your article about that, what does it reveal about the weaknesses is in company culture today? So maybe you can explain a bit more about that. It would be very interesting.
Of course, Nicola, and it's indeed also an important one. In short, the whistleblowing directive, in fact, protects individuals who come forward to report wrongdoing within a work-related context. And the whistleblowing directive has been implemented in the meantime in Belgium via the Belgian Whistleblowing Act. There is a specific scope for which kind of issues you can report on. And in Belgium, it has been decided when implementing the Belgian Whistleblowing Act that this also applies to reports on breaches concerning social fraud. And social fraud is interpreted broadly because according to an interpretation of the Belgian government authorities, this covers all kinds of violations of discrimination, harassment, and well-being laws. The Act obliges companies to set up internal reporting channels and also procedures to handle whistleblowing reports effectively. And it also sets up the possibility to report to external reporting channels, which are then set up by government authorities, or under strict conditions, possibility to make a public disclosure. The Act protects whistleblowers from any form of retaliation, including dismissal, and this ensures that they can speak up without fear of adverse consequences. Non-compliance with these obligations is not taken lightly because companies risk administrative fines or even significant criminal penalties if they do not observe the requirements of the Act. It indeed can reveal certain company culture weaknesses because the implementation of this Belgian Whistleblowing Act in 2023, and in particular the introduction of whistleblowing hotlines across the various sectors, had cast a spotlight on workplace misconduct and psychosocial hazards. And so we expect the legal framework on whistleblowing to have a big impact on this, especially in the context of company culture and DEI-related aspects. And so in this respect, it's important to recognize that the workforce is evolving. I already mentioned, I refer to this younger generation, which the Generation Z and the millennials. When in fact, there has been recent studies that show that these younger generation hold different values and aspirations compared to their predecessors. They, as I mentioned, they are more sensitive to DEI issues. And we also anticipate that these younger employees will be more proactive in using the speak up channels provided by the whistleblowing framework. And the combination of this whistleblowing legal framework and the shifting expectations of the younger workforce will, in our view, send a clear message to boards and executive committees in order to attract and retain talent, to prevent and address workplace issues. It will be necessary to have these effective reporting channels, these procedures, these policies in place. And it's important to deal with any reports of wrongdoings in a quickly and in a professional way. And this means doing objective and thorough internal investigations that respect the rights and interests of all parties involved. And it also means that if someone has done something wrong, that the right steps need to be taken to fix the situation and if needed, to discipline the person who's responsible for these acts. Over to you, Nicola.
Okay, thank you, Inge. Very interesting to hear about this whistleblowing directive. I would like to talk a bit also about the role of the board of directors, because at Guberna we're an institute of directors, and to that I will also talk to Géraldine. Who are at Umicore today, at the one hand, the management board, but also your supervisory board, involved in the definition, but also the follow-up of such DI policy, or more generally sustainable HR. What could a board play in this matter? Up to you. Thank you.
Of course, Nico, but if I may, I just want to touch briefly on what Inge said, because the whistleblowing directive is very important, and we did implement that about a year and a half ago at Umicore. And it really is what you say, Inge. I mean, we combined the whistleblowing implementation with a campaign which is called I Speak Up campaign. Mm-hmm. And we really saw, we had a hotline before, an anonymous hotline, but with the campaign and the real implementation of the regulation, we saw that the cases of whistleblowing acts more than doubled than what we had before. And indeed, many people, I mean, are anonymous, but at some point, sometimes they identify themselves to the whistleblowing channel, and there are many younger people that do that as well. But so it's a very useful tool. Maybe go back to your question: what's the role of the management board and of the supervisory board with respect to the D&I, and what role can they play? I would say, I mean, it's a super important role for them. I mean, the supervisory board and the management board, they define the strategy of the company, they define the values and the culture of the company. And so they have to be the driver behind the adoption of a clear and effective DE&I policy and process. They're the ones that have to be the instigators and the drivers that these are adopted, and secondly, implemented in a consistent way. So I would say in practice, of course, the policies are prepared by teams in the field. And at Umicore, they're prepared under the guidance and the sponsorship of the management board as a whole, or a specific member of the management board, depending on the topic. For instance, whistleblowing came more to me. When there is specific things with respect to diversity, it goes to my colleague Anna, who is our CHRO. So it really depends a little bit. And others, like the values of the company, of course, is decided by the entire management board. So it depends on the topic. And the supervisory board, of course, doesn't go into the nitty-gritty of the individual policies, but they are the ones that are ultimately responsible to make sure that these policies exist. So they're the ones that have to keep the management board accountable that they adopt these policies, and they have to make sure that they get implemented. And the best way to do that as a supervisory board is by asking questions, putting the topic on the table, and really holding the management board accountable for both having the procedures and implementing them. So the SB really sets the tone, and then it trickles down through the management board, which then trickles it down again through the entire organization. As I said, put the KPIs. I have my KPIs on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Make sure that they're on the long term and the short term. For instance, in our case, the supervisory board has set for the management board KPIs in the remuneration report. So it's a public document. In the short term, we have, for instance, the objective of when we have hiring, that 35% of our managerial hires need to be women. That's one of my KPIs, determining my variable remuneration. And last year, as a company, we are jointly responsible for that. So everybody is as responsible and accountable for the entire group. So last year, we did not reach the 35%. We only reached about 31%. And that had its impact. On the long term, because you can't forget the long term, we have what we call a diversity of thought index. And the diversity of thought index is on 3 years, and it has several aspects. It has a diversity of gender aspect, a diversity of international background, and a diversity of experience element. So these three form an index, which we have to progress on in 3 years. So these also have an impact on our long-term variable remuneration. And by setting these objectives and KPIs and holding us accountable for them, then we in turn set similar KPIs and priorities to our teams, and that way it goes down through the organization. And at management board level, we get updated on these topics every month. We follow it up, and on the supervisory board level, we generally at least do it twice a year. So it's topics that really get followed up on a regular basis.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. And as governance expert at Guberna, we can only agree with what you say, that a board of directors, or in your case, a supervisory board, shouldn't get involved in the nitty-gritty detail of all the of such topics, but should indeed define the directions in which the organization should go in these matters, and then of course control that it happens in practice. So there's these different roles here of a board, and thank you for this testimonial. I would like to remind to our audience that you can still ask questions, but I don't see any question at the moment. But please, if you have questions to our speakers, write them in the chat. In the meantime, I want to ask also a similar question to Christian. Because Christian, you have the legal perspective, and how do you perceive as a legal advisor the role of a board of directors specifically? And for example, what kind of questions could they ask to management in this regard?
Thank you, Nicola. Well, first of all, I would like to echo to a large extent what Geraldine explained, in the sense that obviously it's a matter for each organization and for each board to decide to what extent they would like to be involved in relation to company culture and diversity and inclusion matters. And I fully agree that probably it's not for a supervisory board to go into the details of policies and all that. That being said, it is our experience as external advisors to organizations that if companies want to move forward in relation to diversity and inclusion, or if companies would like, in that respect, change their company culture, that even the supervisory board should be involved in that respect. But ultimately, that is a matter for the supervisory board to decide. But what we see in organizations that have successful D&I strategies and are working on the company culture, then in all these cases, we see that also even the supervisory board is involved. And in that context, there are, I think, 4 big areas where we see that boards can have a significant role to play. One, and that is also in line with what Geraldine already mentioned. One, a board obviously could be involved in setting the DE&I strategy and the DE&I goals. And obviously that will be an interaction with executive management. But the higher you determine that type of strategy in the organization, the more successful that strategy will be. And even supervisory boards have a role to play. Second role that the board can or could play in that area is obviously, once a strategy has been determined, is to monitor progress in relation to that strategy. And there are a number of tools that boards could use in that respect, up to relating back to what Geraldine explained, for example, setting KPIs in relation to remuneration of executive management. But there are obviously a number of other areas where the board can play its role in relation to measuring progress. And to some extent, turning back to what we started at the beginning of the seminar, obviously the Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Sustainability Due Diligence Directive will, to a large extent, force boards to have a clear view on these matters, because that is the direct consequence of these increased reporting obligations. And the third area, and that brings us closer back to the legal stuff, if I can express myself in that way, is obviously DE&I, or the lack of DE&I, should also be monitored from a risk management perspective and a compliance perspective. And also on that level, boards can play a role. And then the final point that I would like to make here is the board, where the board can play an important role, is leading by example, depending on the D&I strategy that is followed. But to the extent that D&I is high at the corporate agenda within the organization, obviously membership of the board and diversity in membership of the board clearly sends a powerful message to the organizations. But so on these four topics, I think that boards can have a significant impact and influence in relation to the D&I strategy of their organization. And simultaneously, depending on how the board position itself, that will then determine also the relevant questions and monitoring in relation to how executive management should react to that strategy. Back to you, Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Christian. That's very insightful, I believe, to hear about the role of that board can play. And I have some questions that came in the chat, so I would like to ask some of them. We have a question from Thomas Snooks, and I guess this question really is more for Geraldine. And the question says, how do you measure the effectiveness of your DEI initiatives, and what specific metrics and KPIs do you use to track progress and ensure accountability? Maybe you can provide some examples. So maybe I can start with this question, maybe see if Geraldine can provide some examples.
Sure. And I'm now seeing that there is another question which relates to diversity of experience. So maybe I can take that one inside, and we try to do both at the same time.
Definitely.
So how do you measure effectiveness? I think the first thing you need to do is see where you're standing. You need to start, you need to create a baseline. And that's something that we're reestablishing again this year, is we're going to be doing a very big employee survey. And I think before you start setting metrics and KPIs and measuring them, you need to know where your company is today, so that you can decide what your priorities are and where you want to head. Because for every company, it's going to be different depending on the industry you're in. For us, 35% women in managerial functions is a stretch. For other companies, it might be much easier, and they might be striving for 40 or 50 or 60% or 50-50. 50-50 is not, of course, the ultimate goal. So you really need to first decide what your objectives are for your company, and that you can only do is you figure out your data and where you are today. And then for us, so the main things we look at are the hiring process, as I said. So that's a metric. 35% of all managerial hires need to be women. That's a KPI that represents, that is throughout the organization. Every business unit, every function has that ambition. We do a little bit of a difference in expectations between corporate functions or softs and industrial functions, because the one is easier, so they should target higher, and the other ones should target 35%. So that's our first KPI. And the second KPI relates, for instance, to this diversity of thought, which is long-term. So make sure you have short-term KPIs and long-term KPIs. And there we have the diversity of gender, the diversity of nationality, and the diversity of experience. So the diversity of nationality, what is important again, is what is relevant for you as a company. For us, it's all about considering our history compared to being Belgian and German. We have a very big Belgian and German base. So we define international diversity as not being Belgian or German. And a different company, that will be a different reference. And then finally, you have the one that relates to experience. And we have 4 big business groups in our company, which are very different. And we believe in stimulating our employees by making them agile, letting them grow, and having them able to, experience the different business groups. And so that's the different experience we're talking about. It's people coming from the outside, bringing a different experience from a different company, a different industry, or people moving within the company, going from, for instance, the catalyst business to the rechargeable battery business, or people in my department going from the legal business to the government affairs business, or going into a different function inside of a company. So these are the differences of the diversity of experience that we talk about. And so once you have set where you're at, then you set where you want to go. And then those are your metrics, and that's what you measure against every 6 months, every year, every month, depending again on the KPI. Our long-term KPIs, it doesn't make sense to monitor them every month. We do so on a yearly basis. The hiring KPI, we got to keep track. We do this every single month that we know where we're at. An important one that I didn't mention before is that it's also very important not to only think about hiring, but it's also important to follow retention and promotion inside your company. That's an important one to improve your diversity as well. So that's important. And then of course, we have the whole well-being, and then we talk about the safety incidents. We talk about burnouts, we talk about well-being, and all that you can also measure with little pulse surveys. So that's also something we do, is if we want to check on a specific topic, we do pulse surveys. There's like 10 questions on a topic, and you can do those on a really regular basis and keep track on how you improve as a company. Maybe a long explanation for a short question, but I'll leave it at that.
No, that's very interesting. I think a very important point that you mentioned is that there are no universal KPIs in this regard. It's each company that should define its own KPI. We have that saying in corporate governance that one size does not fit all. And I think each company should tailor its diversity needs in function of its own specificity. So thank you for this. I would like to take another question from Catherine. I don't know which Catherine it is. We don't have the family name. Who says most companies are also aiming for diversity of origin, ethnicity, and we get questions on that in ESG surveys. But how best manage those questions with the Belgian legislation? Because indeed, I can say that it's probably sensitive topics. I don't know who wants to answer such question about diversity with regard to ethnicity.
As you wish, I can take the question if you.
Yes, please, Inge.
Well, there is of course a more broader aspect on it. First, in order to increase this diversity and increase recruitment, of course, you have to have an open culture and make sure to welcome a diverse employment force. And that means also that in your recruitment processes that you make sure that they are sufficiently objective, open, transparent, that people from different origins can see these these vacancies and can apply to it. But that's a more broader comment that I have. With respect to the Belgian legislation, we have, and I briefly refer to it, we have a different anti-discrimination legislation, which means that in any event you cannot certain protection grounds you cannot use them to, for instance, avoid recruiting certain regions. It also has the discrimination legislation also has to a certain extent possibilities to have positive action. So positive discrimination as such is also forbidden, and it can also only apply if certain conditions are fulfilled. And one of these elements that you have is these positive actions, and we've seen that at different levels within the governments, there have been programs that have been introduced in order to make it possible to provide for certain positive actions in order to encourage and to make sure that a certain group of employee population can be selected in preference. And we see with these kind of positive actions, these are then some kind of measures that companies can introduce, like, for instance, making sure that if traineeships are offered, that there is that these are then short-term traineeships, that there is a preference for certain trainees with a certain origin and ethnicity. It's always a temporary measure that are taken, and it's within the strict conditions of this legislation, but there are possibilities to do so.
Thank you, Inge, for this clear answer. I have here another question from Christine Darville, which asks us what is the impact on the new acts, I guess, for example, new legislation on ESG, on the composition on the board. I guess the question relates, because I don't think that there is the specific requirements in the ESG acts itself on how your board should be composed, but I guess it's more what new skills maybe would you need, what new skills, maybe what new diversity should you need in your board to take up these challenges. Is there someone who wants to take that question?
I can take it, Nicola. So there is requirements, and that requirement will be strengthened compared to previous legislation. So in relation to reporting, you will need to report in the context of the Sustainability Reporting Directive. You will need to report on diversity within the governance bodies of your organization. So there is an impact, but it doesn't set a standard. It's just requiring reporting on that. But on the other hand, what we also see is that on the side, you have, for example, a new directive, Women on Board Directive, which then will have a direct impact across the EU in relation to standards on composition of boards. But under the reporting directives in itself, it's just a requirement to report on diversity in relation to the board.
Okay, thank you. That's very clear. I don't see another question. I see indeed only a testimony from Luc Gillis, who says, I was working for a German DAX listed company, just to confirm that ESG and DEI have a huge impact on the business and company culture over the last 3 years. So it really shows that it becomes a topic that is more and more important for board. I see just another question that just arrived, and maybe that will be the last question because we come at the end of our session. The question says, it is from Patrick Beselaar, and it says, all those best practices will be primarily introduced by public listed companies, but they represent less than 1% of the Belgian companies. Can you give some recommendation to the other smaller companies where to begin. I don't know if Christian, Inge, you're also in contact with smaller companies, SMEs, also confronted with such challenges, and maybe it's, yeah, they have this specific challenge in this regard.
Well, maybe a first point is that where it was true that in relation to sustainability reporting, that was up to now to a large extent a matter for mainly listed companies, but the group was a little bit larger than that. But in relation to the corporate sustainability directive, the scope has been expanded. So a number of the requirements under that directive will target a much bigger group of organizations, including also smaller organizations compared to what was previously the case. But I agree, I fully agree that the smallest organizations will still not fall within the scope of that directive. That being said, what we see is that the war for talent is happening across our labor market, and it is not distinguished between big organizations and smaller organizations. And so the trend in relation to what is a good company culture and to what extent a company should invest or take care about diversity and inclusion is not necessarily a question that stops with the bigger organizations. Also for smaller organizations, a good company culture could be a useful tool in the war for talent. But again, that's not a lawyer's point of view. That's a view on what I see happening in the market.
Maybe I can say, not from a lawyer point of view, but from a company point of view, I would simply say that start with including it in the basics, and that means in your company culture and in your values that you want to, how you want to be identified as a company, how you want to be seen, and what kind of values you want to proclaim. And once you've done that basis, then do also not then or at the same time, but actually before, do a survey within your employees. Try to identify what is most needed and most valued in your organization, because all this diversity, equity, and inclusion is about making the people in your organization happy employees and engaged employees. So see by an employee survey what need is biggest and what's most important for you as a company to progress on. And once you've identified that, what is it that your employees need, and what is it that you can give them, then you can start working on your values, on your culture, and then implementing step by step and simply improving the topics that matter most to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Geraldine. It was really interesting. So I think we come to the end of this to this session. If I have to just give 2 or 3 takeaways, that first, there are legislation coming, and companies and boards especially need to take care that those legislation are complied with, and that's a very important task for the board. But DEI is not only about compliance and legislation. There is also a very important strategic aspect to it to be able to attract employees, for example. And here the board should also make sure that indeed diversity, equity, and inclusion are included in the company culture of the organization at all levels of the company. And so there is also this role for the board of directors. So I would like to thank all of you, Inge, Christian, and Geraldine, for your very valuable insights during this webinar. And before we close the session, I would like to recall our national member forum on 6th June, because the theme of this event will be acting on the S in ESG. And this includes topics such as labor practices, diversity, inclusion, but also community engagement and supply chain management. So I think it's a perfect sequel to the discussion we had today. We will be welcome happy to welcome you there. So thank you to our speakers, and thank you to you Gubernam members who followed this session and for all your questions. So goodbye and good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.